Okay, this is an audio review for Rape, Racism, and the Law by Jennifer Riggins. Okay, so in the article, she's trying to talk about the way that we understand rape also is filtered through our kind of social hierarchies and social understandings, right? So there's been this narrow focus on black offenders and white victims when it comes to the focus on rape in American society. Though we pretty much ignore when the situation is flipped as she comes to speak about in the article, that has a lot to do with the historical construction of the laws as to what was considered rape or who was considered rapeable, right? So the history of rape in this country has had such a narrow focus, and the selective focus ignores the reality that black women have been subjugated through the system, that their rape has been considered not a crime in a lot of contexts, and that all women, regardless of their race, their class, their sexual orientation, any of this, are subject to pervasive and harmful sexual coercion and sexual assaults of all kinds. So the focus shouldn't be so strictly on whiteness, purity, again, coming back to these notions of racism and eugenics, right? That women were somehow the arbiters of the white race, that you had to protect, their offspring and purity and all this kind of crap. And so a lot of this is really tied into our history. Why is it that today it's still harder for women of color to have, their violent crimes, sexual crimes against them taken seriously? It's because there's a historical and cultural legacy of denying the kind of rights and livelihood of especially black women when it comes to their own sexual autonomy. So, during slavery, the death penalty or castration was a consequence for a black man if he was accused of raping a white woman, while white men were raping slaves as a norm. It was actually considered a way to, have more property, right? That it served as a way to, and that's really disgusting if you read, any of the kind of narratives of the time period, which is actually really well put together by Angela Davis in her Women, Race, and Class book, from the 1970s, where she kind of digs into this history and talks about how, the normalcy of white men raping, that they would literally like justify to themselves that somehow this was helpful or benevolent and protective or any of these kind of other disgusting justifications, as we've talked about. Obviously, when it comes to any form of inequality, there's always an ideology that justifies it in society. But even when it comes to the most egregious things, right, there's still this ideology of justification. So again, the history is important to understand why we still have these issues today. So allegations of rape after the Civil War were still affected by the racial constructions from before the Civil War, right? Or when slavery was still, a large institution in American society. So, after the Civil War, race neutral was basically the way that these things were interpreted as, there's just a victim and an offender, and that's how it's interpreted. But of course, the standards were still the same as they were before the Reconstruction era, right? Where white women's victimization was taken much more seriously than black women's. And of course, for black women, whether they were raped by white men or by black men, they were dismissed, right? And again, a lot of this has to do with the racialized sexualizing of people. So this is where those kind of definitions and cultural understandings of race and class and gender, all kind of overlap and affect each other, right? So the way that black women were maligned or kind of seen as hypersexual or things like that is a way to justify horrible treatment of them, to say, well, there's no way to charge someone of a crime because this person doesn't have the sexual autonomy to say no, right? And we already live in a rape culture that justifies all sorts of horrible violence and assaults against women every day in this country. So the last thing we need, though, is to still, instead of when we're addressing these issues in the modern era, to actually fix them, we still have a racialized bias, a class bias, sexualized bias, all of these biases that affect the way that we then interpret, who gets justice, who's an actual, what we consider like a credible victim, all of these horrible things. So, lynching is a big part of this as well. So lynching was considered a justifiable punishment for men who were accused of not just raping a white woman, but sometimes just saying hello, whistling, looking at a white woman. as was the case with Emmett Till, right? The very famous case of Emmett Till, that a lot of people argue was, a big momentous, kind of push towards the civil rights movement because of the horrible way in which he was brutalized. And the fact that his mother had the courage to have an open casket, funeral, and how, that image of him in the casket that was published in Jet magazine, how much that galvanized people to realize just how horrific this kind of, racialized system of justice was. And so with Emmett Till, he was accused of, I believe it was whistling at a white woman who herself on her deathbed recanted that he never did. He never did. He was beaten to death. He was drowned, all sorts of horrible, horrible treatment. And his case is just one of literally thousands of people who went through the system of, lynching. Actually, Georgia just created this, memorial for all sorts of victims there. And so we're barely dealing with the historical ramifications of this. The fact that generations of men and women, there were women who were lynched as well, but so much of lynching focused on the protection of white women, the sexuality aspect. So again, the intersections, how the ideas of race and sex overlap, right? So that's why for so many men that were lynched, castration was a normative part of this, largely because there was this connection between not just, killing him or hurting him, but humiliating him sexually to also dominate him. So, once lynching was considered justifiable punishment, it was something that wasn't taken legally seriously. There was no way to really have any ramifications for it. It was something that was, again, kind of a mob rule situation. But, people argued that after, once you get through this period of the Civil War and lynchings are used as justifiable punishments, that the legal system itself became its own form of lynching, right, or what they call legal lynching. So this is when the legal system treats people in a way that mirrors the stigma and the hatred that led to lynchings in the first place, except for this time they're doing it through the court system. So it looks a little bit cleaner, right, than inviting everyone to a place to burn someone alive or beat them to death with chains or, these horrific displays that families often brought their children to and took pictures with the corpses of people hanging from trees. I mean, this is a horrific part of American history that we never face, that we never even talk about unless you take like a African American studies class or something of that nature, right? Or if you discuss it in history class in high school, it's for a minute. And so we don't understand just how much the seeds of those things that were planted then have kind of, sown certain racialized understandings that we're still reaping today, right? When it comes to the consequences in the criminal justice system. So, whether you're an offender or a victim, there's not justice in a system that doesn't have, proper protections for all people, that is only slanted towards the most powerful, as we see in our own criminal justice system, right? That we know that race and class, and of course gender also, matter significantly in, whether you're sentenced, whether you're charged, what the length of your sentence is, all of those kind of consequences vary dramatically based on these social criteria that shouldn't affect it, right? Because again, if it's considered something that's just, kind of is what it is, it's just something that's there. It's almost like the way that we look at the system itself as colorblind, right? Oh, it's just you committed a crime, you go to jail. That we're obscuring the ways in which these things are predicated upon our biases and our inequalities. So the rape of white women by black men was used to justify harsh penalties for a lot of years, and still has a lot to do with the media attention and the special treatment that's given to, white women in those situations, while, larger statistics, if we look at them in a kind of more macro way, we see that rape is one of the most prevalent violent crimes and one of the most underreported of all crimes. And of course, if we were in class, we would talk all about, why is that, right? What makes our culture a rape culture? Well, of course, it's the fact that we stigmatize victims. We make it their fault. We ask them, where were they? What were they doing? What were they wearing? Were they drinking? Did they sleep with this person before? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As if it's their fault, right? Which is a thing you don't do to victims of other crimes. Like you don't go to someone who was just mugged and say, well, I mean, you were walking through that poor neighborhood. What did you expect? Right? Or go up to someone who was carjacked and say, well, what did you expect driving a nice car like that around, giving people the wrong idea? Right? We don't do that. We don't say when people has a home invasion of their house, we don't say, are you sure? Are you sure that someone broke into your house? Are you sure? Right? We don't doubt them. We don't question them in that way. Right? We respect people as victims of crimes in some ways. That's still not done in our culture, right? It's a rape culture. So that means that we justify and really stigmatize the people who have been affected and not the people who commit the crimes, which makes absolutely no goddamn sense, right? So, and again, obviously this has a lot to do with our historical context when we're talking about this in light of the article itself, right? But it's important to note that we still live in a rape culture that's very prevalently problematic, right? So that's why it's one of the most often or most prevalent violent crimes, but one of the most underreported, right? Because of the stigma. So think about it. Power has a lot to do with who we listen to, right? Meaning we tend to disregard women when they have claims of these things, largely because they have less power and status in society. They're more likely that we believe that they exaggerate or aren't credible, things of this nature, right? So think about it in the way that the other kind of structural power systems also affect the way that we consider who deserves justice, who is a victim, and who isn't. We have this notion of a perfect victim. So when it comes to rape cases, just in the general criminal justice system, it's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a fraction that actually end up in jail, meaning a fraction of the people who actually commit the crime are how many people actually report the crime. Of those reported, how many people are charged is a fraction of that. So then when you look at how many people charged are actually convicted, fraction of that. How many convicted or sentenced, fraction of that. And how many serve out their time, fraction of that. So it's like, a percentage of a percentage of a percentage of a percentage. So it's such, what kind of message does that send to survivors that look at the system and say, wow, well, that person, like look at a Christine Blasey Ford. You come out, you tell your story about Brett Kavanaugh. It's humiliating. It literally destroys your job, your life. You have to move. You have to leave your career. You have to change everything about your life. And then what happens? Nothing. He gets on the Supreme Court forever. So what kind of message does that send to other people who may have experienced something when they feel like no one's going to listen to them, no one's going to think they're credible, so there's no point in coming forward? Now add to this a situation in which you have no status or power. You're literally considered a second-class citizen, right? In a Jim Crow era South, where even in today's, in the modern era, which we'll talk about in a moment, having less representative power, having more stigma and more deviance placed upon someone because of their race or ethnicity or because of, poverty or things of this nature means that we just don't care as much when these things happen to people that have less power. Right? So in many ways, the system really looks at who a person is as a deviant identity more so than what they've done. So when it comes to, any of these things, executions, lack of representational juries, this is a huge issue, right? So meaning, even though there are not laws that say you can't dismiss a juror based on their race, there are ways to arbitrarily dismiss a person that leads to juries that aren't of one's peers, right? Meaning there are some restrictions that say you can't just say, okay, all the black people can't be on the jury, or all the, Latinos or whatever it is. You can just say, though, oh, this person's left-handed, so therefore I don't want left-handed people on the jury. Or that person has a big ears, and we don't want anyone with big ears. And so it's a way to they can arbitrarily dismiss people. So it's really a way to get around the strictures in the system. And of course, when we look at executions, we can see just how disproportionately affected those things are when you look at, even today, when you look at death row. But of course, during time periods of more racial segregation and strife, you see obviously who is being put on, being charged with capital crimes and what for. The penalties are much harsher for those that have the less power. So, when it came to charges of rapes committed by black men against white women, these were treated with much more harshness than any other kinds of rape, as if this is the only kind that matters or counts. Why? Because it's challenging a power hierarchy system, right? It's challenging white supremacy. And so that's why it becomes so fearful and so guarded against. And it's literally like the baseline of the movie, Birth of a Nation, that kind of caused a resurgence of the KKK, right? The early turn of the 20th century, right? That it was literally shown in the White House. I mean, that's insane, right? That, well, I guess it's not. We still have a white supremacist in presidency. But anyway, it's insane to have a situation where, a movie that's promoting the Klan, which is a domestic terrorist organization, would be considered like the vanguard, the most, the height of cultural relevance in film, right? But really, it was just a bunch of white people in blackface pretending that, basically this woman, is being chased by this black man and he's going to, hurt her sexually. And so the whole thing is predicated on this idea of protecting white women and this benevolence. So there's a sexist element connected to the racist element, right? So the racist element is to assume hypersexuality in black men and to assume that they somehow want to target white women, which again, none of those things are real. But then they connect to that this kind of assumed weakness of white women, right? And assumed kind of benevolence of white men, that they're the protectors. And so all of these disgusting narratives get kind of chewed up and moved around and filter their way into the way that all of our institutions work from that time period, especially the law, right? So the selective focus that she talks about in the article is very significant because the outcome of this is very disparate treatment in the legal system. So specifically of black men, you can see the way they've been maligned historically. I mean, we could talk all day about, or if you want to just like read the book, The New Jim Crow, that'll give you the whole, she does a good job of talking about the legal history situation, right? But really talking about how, from basically the days of convict leasing right after the emancipation of slavery, there's been a target on the back of black men when it comes to the legal system, right? And then again, often leading to executions based on, testimonies or just kind of frivolous evidence that doesn't have any real weight to it, being the only thing to then put someone on death row. So again, like the Emmett Till situation that the woman recanted on her deathbed. No, he actually didn't whistle at me. He was murdered, but he didn't actually whistle at me, is just one example of how the kind of social structures and the pressures affect the way that we then interpret justice or who deserves justice. So another consequence of this she talks about in the article is the denial of the rape of black women. And this began in slavery, but it continues to this day. As it was commonplace and accepted for white men to rape black women in the past, that selective focus on black men hurting or somehow targeting white women has really obscured and biased our understandings or interpretations of the fact that violent crime is bad, no matter who does it or no matter to whom. But we care so much about the social status and hierarchies that affects the way that we then see worth within, who is then harmed or who is an offender. So, the rape of black women by white men was normalized, and it was a tool of white supremacy. So the legal system, that in the years that followed slavery really followed that notion that women, especially black women, just didn't have any autonomy, no sexual autonomy, that you couldn't rape them, right? That it was considered that even, a rape of a black woman by any man, right, regardless of his race, was dismissed as not a crime. So there's a legal excerpt example in the reading that shows how the legal system had dismissed a case of a male slave raping a female slave who was under 10 years old. So this, again, held black men to lesser standards of sexual restraint with black women than with, than are white men or with white women. So also white men are held to lesser standards of restraint with black women than are black men with white women. So again, neither white nor black, the men themselves were never expected to show real sexual restraint with black women. So this sets a cultural and a societal context for the denial of assault against black women, seeing them or targeting them and victimizing them, giving them less status and power serves a powerful interest of white supremacy, but also of patriarchy, right? So, of course, after slavery, the rape of black women by white men persisted as it was normalized, but the way that these things had to be understood in the cultural narrative changed as the structures changed, right? So this set of myths about black female sexuality came about to kind of justify horrible, predatory treatment of women. So, based on supposed promiscuity, right, this was an excuse for white men's sexual abuse of black women. So courts would levy assumptions that, a young white woman was virginal, right? And just chaste and pure, and that young black women were not chaste. So they can't be raped because they're not, virginal, right? Which again, it's a lot of these kind of social assumptions that connect how we understand race, how we understand sexuality, how we understand class, how we understand gender, how they're all intricately, combined or intertwined together to form the basis of the notion of how we understand the world that we live in today, right? And so this affects the way that, crimes are either pursued or not today, meaning police tend to give less seriousness to reports of rape of black women. So according to research that was presented in the reading, we can see how the history of these arguments originated, in the justification of slavery, but it became entrenched in the culture. And those stereotypes, those kind of, the Jezebel, the Sapphire, all of these horrible, archaic stereotypes about black women, themselves got through the culture, became justifications, and they worked their way into the legal institutions through precedents that denied that black women could be raped. And so this really sets up the context for why is it that we still don't take these things seriously? Well, because we have a legacy and a history of that. And that has really prejudiced us towards seeing these issues of violent crime, as an unbiased, equal issue.